The question then is how we can account for such material in our reading experience, and further how we can talk about the role this material plays in producing or directing aesthetic experiences. To begin, James Thorpe, in his essay The Aesthetics of Textual Criticism, describes the long chain of authors that mediate our reading experience. Quote, "It can be claimed that nearly every person involved in the transmission of literary works helps, in some sense, to shape the effect that a work will have on a reader. The designer, for instance, can in some measure make the experience of reading the book a little more pleasant or easy or irritating by the appropriateness of the format, paper, binding, font, and size of type. His work is not usually observed consciously. In order to realize something of the range of his effect, however, one has only to imagine reading Tom Jones in black letter throughout, on coated art paper, with the sheets printed alternately in red and black, in a tight binding with no inner margin, with illustrations by Willem de Kooning." End quote. Thorpe contends that while anything can be an aesthetic object, traditional aesthetic judgments occur in a space cleared by the context of this extended and physically creative chain. Thorpe's argument pertains primarily to practical editorial concerns, but does offer a literary reiteration of externalist approaches to aesthetics, and more broadly suggests the need to read past or through, or ideally in full consciousness, of the textual body when considering aesthetic encounters in literature. This in turn requires interpretive strategies capable of describing the invitation to aesthetic experience, without giving the formal structure of works primacy over the material here-ness of items. This section, as a result, seeks to expand definitions of formalism to include such materiality and provide some examples of how this might actually work in practice. So the first issue to address is whether formalism is an appropriate paradigm for such discussions. That is, whether formalist reading strategies are actually flexible enough to account for the physical items implicated in delivering textual works. Several contemporary proponents of what's called the new formalism suggest that they are, in fact, up to the task. Ellen Rooney provides one example of how definitions of form can expand to encompass such concerns. In her essay, Form and Contentment, she writes, quote, "In my argument, form is not a coded reference to literature as such or to the great books canon that have been expanded and revised by both literary critics and cultural scholars," end quote. Rooney maintains that examinations of form are essential to literary interpretation, while also expanding her uses of form beyond the concerns of formalism as a historically defined reading practice. She posits that different forms require different vocabularies, a move that provides one vital link between her articulation of formalism and the issue of material textuality. Quote, again quoting Rooney, "Forms themselves are inevitably heterogeneous and contentious, but they in turn provide a site for renewed polemic, debate, and the production of alternative theoretical objects." Understood in this matter, material textuality itself constitutes a possible alternative theoretical object, whose own forms might interface in productive ways with more established literary varieties of forms. Reading for these forms, too, doesn't require eliding their participation in broader cultural contexts. To this end, Rooney mounts an ideological argument for formal attentiveness, again quoting Rooney. "The fine grain of both the reproduction and the revolution of social life is thus always a matter of its myriad and incomplete forms. To disavow form not only guarantees a kind of boredom, a familiarity that makes the everyday unbearable, but it is also ideological in the most profound sense, as Althusser observed, the absolute form of ideology, fetishism." End quote. Importantly, the spell, or I guess the aura in Benjamin's terms, of the object also risks subtending dominant ideologies in the absence of attention to the formal dimensions of the physical. The physical, it works exactly in the same sense as Rooney is talking about the formal or the referential content of the works. I'll return to the significant social and professional consequences of this more expanded conception of form in the final section of the paper, but for the moment, I'd like to examine in a little more detail how broader notions of formalism might include, but are not limited to, greater attention to the textual page as a visual field, how the physical construction of text can influence our aesthetic interpretations, and in particular what these two preceding concerns means for our understanding of digital literacy. In her essay, Shakespeare in Slow Motion, Marjorie Garber asserts that reading might benefit from a focus on slow motion, as both concept and practice. Garber relates her notion of slow motion to Ruben Brouwer's Reading in Slow Motion, but expresses her desire to extend the field of concern beyond basic metaphors for attentiveness to a categorically distinct style of reading she calls slow reading, which draws more openly from film, photography, visual art, dance, or performance. She asks, quote, "What would happen if the idea of slow motion were taken more literally, or more historically, or more precisely, to accord with developments in the visual field?" End quote. Despite posing it, Garber leaves this question partially unanswered, particularly regarding the parameters of the visual field that she speaks of. Briefly, her concern with slow motion and the visual field seems mostly invested in conceptually and practically redeveloping close reading strategies. But at the same time, she says that she's interested in more than sort of mere attentiveness. Again, that's my paraphrasing. However, I want to take her focus on the visual field in particular much more literally, and suggest that incorporating visual formalism into our reading practices can not only slow down reading in the way Garber suggests, but also pose key questions about the nature of aesthetic experience itself by fixing attention on material textuality and the cultural codes that are often embedded in the physical grammar of specific items. There remains room, in other words, to think about how slow reading practices can and in some ways must apply to the entire interpretive field of the physical object, and can join literary and the cultural leaning interpretive methodologies. Garber herself gestures towards this possibility when discussing the latent politics that can rise up from such disjuncture or practices of reading. More generally, I suggest that this kind of close reading exposes the artificial divide between close reading and reading for historical context. Periodical studies are one example of how this might actually work in practice. In their article, The Rise of Periodical Studies, Sean Latham and Robert Scholes discuss the implications of this growing field of literary research. Quote, "While individual scholars or students might be able to mine periodicals for a narrow range of materials relating to their fields, they are rarely in a position to say much about the periodical as a whole, that is, as a whole object. As a consequence, we have often been too quick to see magazines merely as containers of discrete bits of information rather than autonomous objects of study." End quote. This narrowness, I argue, has much to do with the fact that periodicals demand to be read with great levels of physical sensitivity, particularly regarding their visual arrangement. In Appendices A and B, I have included the recto and verso sides of an issue of the Saturday Evening Post from July 28, 1906. Now, displayed correctly, these units would form a wall of interconnected visual information, communicated via arrangement, typography, and positioning with regard to other images. On the recto side, we have the beginning of a serial story by Joseph Conrad, with unusually long margins and a bold pictorial design. There are many questions posed by an item of this kind, but for my purposes, these queries center principally on the conceptual categories by which we participate in aesthetic experiences, and how these categories are directed by physical arrangements. Does Conrad's story become more visceral and worldly due to the impression of a straight-from-the-presses headline mentality? Perhaps this connection with journalism inhibits our ability to experience the text aesthetically, pointing towards the status of journalism as an incorrect genre or category for socially constructed ideas about what constitutes high aesthetic modes. As the eye wanders between these pages, absorbing the content and filling it with context, there's also the commercial context from the verso side to consider. Latham and Scholes state the questions that arise from such strange juxtapositions, strange to us, juxtapositions. Quote, "Are ads text or image? Are they content or just front and back matter? Do they matter at all?" End quote. There are definite aesthetics considerations at work in this interplay between word, text, and work, and the aesthetic experience we have in encountering such items in their full visual and semantic complexity attains even further interpretive depth in being largely the product of what we might call paratextual, and even more interestingly, resolutely, unabashedly commercial material.